Hello and welcome to our latest Sunday session. Throughout this COVID crisis, I've been seeking to bring interesting, informative and provocative guests online in a way that I normally do as the MP for Epsom with community meetings in the Epsom electorate. So over the years, we've had US ambassadors, mayors, Reserve Bank governors, former Reserve Bank governors, Council for Financial Advice, all sorts of people present in person. But over this COVID crisis, we've had to move online, which has meant, we can share these meetings with a lot more people. And we've sought to have guests who are relevant to what's happening in New Zealand at the moment. So if you've been watching each Sunday, you'll know that we had Jeff Liu. He's Taiwan's representative in Auckland to tell us about how the Taiwanese people dealt with the COVID crisis and what we might be able to learn from them. We've had the former Finance Minister, Sir Roger Douglas, who has had to handle a major fiscal crisis and do the kind of reform that made New Zealand prosperous again, to learn how we might be able to emerge from this crisis. We've had the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative, Oliver Hartwich, who happens to be German, but gave us a really useful perspective, independent from that, of how West Germany recovered from the ruins of World War II with a private sector-led response as opposed to the government-led response in Britain, which is very relevant to the time that we're in right now. Today's guest is somebody who won't need much introduction, if any, and he's going to talk to us about the rule of law. It's not something that we talk about in mainstream politics very often, mainly because I think we can usually take it for granted in New Zealand, but with the state taking so much power and invading people's liberties and arguably potentially their homes under the latest legislation, the idea that somebody's rights are written down in the law in a way that they can access and understand and have applied equally to all people has become absolutely critical. But in the spirit of these Sunday sessions, I thought it was important to bring in a real heavyweight and an expert, and that is the Honourable Chris Finlayson QC. Let me just say a few things about Chris. Chris is known for his absolutely cutting and acerbic style and tone that only a person who's across their brief can afford to use. But a side of Chris that a lot of people may not have seen is that when I was a 31-year-old elected to Parliament as the sole member of my Parliament, it was Chris who was the MP who actually took me under his wing, took me out for dinner every now and then and asked how it was all going. And I'll always be grateful for having seen that side of Chris that many in the public may not have had the opportunity to. Chris is also a former partner in Bell Gully, one of the big four law firms, and for 9 years he served as Attorney General. During that time, we navigated some very challenging issues. The frankly disgraceful Foreshore and Seabed Act that the Labour Party put in to extinguish people's legal property rights before the courts was reversed, and a very difficult balancing act put in place to reinstate the legal rights of iwi to have their day in court, while balancing that against New Zealanders' wish to be able to have what many see as a right to access the beach. He also oversaw a very high quality process of updating our laws for the SIS and the GCSB. Of course, technology changed, society changed. We needed different laws in that area, and everyone in Parliament from both sides of the House and all parties admired the way that Chris took everybody with him through that. Chris also undertook more settlements of treaty grievances than any other Minister for Treaty Settlements in the history of our country. And as a result of that, a lot of old wounds have been settled in a way that will always be controversial for some, but nevertheless is an important part of our country moving forward. So I've spent about 5 minutes going on, and Chris has been patiently waiting. It's time to bring Chris in to talk about the rule of law and the events that have occurred over the past 8 weeks with government in a crisis. It's going to be based a little bit on the excellent opinion piece appearing on Stuff today that we might be able to bring up, and also based on a much longer piece that is a speech that Chris recently gave to the University of the Third Age. So that's enough. Chris, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us on our Sunday session.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me and for those very, very generous comments. And while we're adopting a spirit of generosity in this afternoon's session, can I congratulate you on the way you have performed in the special select committee that was set up. I, for one, was very dubious about whether it would succeed, but I think it's been, frankly, Parliament at its best. And your incisive questioning of public officials has been extremely valuable. And I also commend my former colleagues as well, because holding officials to account in a time of crisis is extremely important, and you did that well.
Yeah, so well, thank you. And just to start with really the basics, we've got to lay the foundations here. The rule of law. Lots of people talk about it. A lot of people think if they talk about it, it will make them sound smarter than perhaps they may be in reality. So let's just break it down and say, what is the rule of law? And secondly, why does it matter? Why do ordinary people have any incentive to care about what sounds like an arcane legal concept?
Yeah, well, one thing it's not is a slogan. And it's often used by opposite sides of a political debate to justify their stance. Last week in the United States, you had Barack Obama saying that letting General Michael Flynn off was undermining the rule of law, when the friends of General Flynn were saying that the prosecution that had taken place against him was undermining the rule of law. And you'll remember the great debate over Florida in 2000. Both sides were invoking the rule of law for their own political purposes. But if I can simply summarize the general principle, and you almost go back to Dr. Thomas Fuller in the 18th century, and he said it this way: be you never so high, the law is above you. We're all servants of the law, and no one is excused. And a great Englishman, Lord Bingham, who was the senior lord in the House of Lords for some years, and then briefly in the Supreme Court before he retired, wrote a really good book on the rule of law. And he summarized it this way, David: all persons and authorities within the state, whether public or private, should be bound by and entitled to the benefit of laws publicly and prospectively promulgated and publicly administered in the courts. And then you can break that core principle down into a number of subheadings, and he did that. So, for example, the law has to be accessible, so far as possible, intelligible, clear, and predictable. And questions of legal rights should be resolved by application of law, not the exercise of discretion. The laws of the land apply to everyone. There should be adequate protection of fundamental human rights. And if there is an issue that needs resolving in the courts, it should be able to be resolved without prohibitive cost or inordinate delay. So those are the kinds of things that underpin the rule of law, but come back to that fundamental principle as expressed in the 18th century. It doesn't matter how grand you are, how rich you are, important you are, prestigious you are, the law is above you.
And that's one thing I like about it, and I think sometimes the left forget, and I know the right forget sometimes, is that the law is fundamentally about equality. It doesn't matter who you are, and actually it's more likely to protect minorities, it's more likely to protect those who may be weaker, because it doesn't matter who you are. You can point to the law and say, these are my rights and these protect me. But I just have another question, that sometimes this can sound a little bit arcane, and you said it's not a slogan. Some people might think it's a little bit melodramatic, and they might say, come on, Jacinda Ardern is many things, but she's not Stalin. She's basically a nice person who believes in democracy. We don't really need to worry about this stuff. What do you say to that?
We always need to worry about this stuff. We never take it for granted. And of course, I agree with your assessment of the Prime Minister. but that's not really the issue. The critical thing is to make sure governments are always held to account on this sort of stuff, because if you let standards slip, then we can find ourselves in trouble. And I go back to the time when I was sort of growing up in the National Party in the 1970s and early 1980s. And frankly, standards slipped because it was centred on one man, Robert Muldoon, and the party was unhappy, and the electorate ultimately showed what it thought on 14 July 1984, when Roger Douglas had to come in with good people like Michael Bassett and David Cagle and others and clean up the mess. You cannot have prime ministerial fiat on anything.
I really like a comment we've just got. Can we get that up, Mitchell, from Ben Skelton? We always need to worry about this stuff, and I think that sums it up. So I guess that takes us to the present, where, you know, if there was ever a time that we need to worry about this stuff, it's a time when the Prime Minister comes out and in her nice way says, I'm asking you all to stay inside. And then the former police commissioner, who retired a few weeks after these events, Mike Bush, comes out and starts saying menacing things like, you might have a ride over to our place, or we might follow you to see where you're going. At that point, I personally became really quite worried about what the state of New Zealanders' rights were. And I remember I actually called you for advice, because as a member of Parliament, I felt it was my duty to be out, at least in the Epsom electorate, observing what was going on so that I could properly represent people. But I didn't know what my rights were at that point. I had to look it up and seek advice. A lot of people were in that situation. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about, you know, if the law is supposed to be accessible for people and they can understand what it was, what was the situation for most people in terms of access to rule of law in the first weeks of our lockdown?
Oh, let's be clear. The Prime Minister's exhortation was sensible, and no one could take fault with that. Look after yourselves, stay indoors. It was good, solid advice. Bush's performance was lamentable because he represented the worst of the police in what he said. And I understand there were instances, particularly with young people, when the police were getting pretty heavy and there was absolutely no legal underpinning for what they were doing. Even just the other day, I heard of a story of a young guy driving along and was stopped and spoken to menacingly. And when matters were sorted out, the constable moved on. But putting courtesy to one side, which is always questionable with some members of the constabulary, there are these serious issues about enforcement of the Prime Minister's general exhortations. And you can't go round enforcing exhortations as though they are the word of law, and even general instructions without the underpinning of the law are of dubious enforcement value.
And it's come to pass subsequently that the Crown may have had legal advice that actually they couldn't do these things of going around and enforcing exhortations and harassing members of the public, which happened in some cases. I have to say, I just want to say, I always say that the average New Zealand cop on the beat is one of the best cops in the world. If I'm going to be harassed by a police force, I'd rather it was the New Zealand police than any other. But clearly some police overstepped it. We had issues. Someone's emailed through a question where a fruit and vegetable store was told by MB it could operate. Then the next day it was told actually it couldn't, and it had to shut down immediately and couldn't even trade out the day or get rid of the stock that had just been arrived by truck. It was then said the reason for this was that it was next to a supermarket. It was pointed out that a branch of Fruit World 800 metres away in Green Lane remained open. Then they said that it's not next to a supermarket, but it's right next to Countdown Green Lane. Then MB said, well, the story is that actually Fruit World, despite its name, is really a supermarket because it sells things other than fruit, to which Jack Lums and Remuera pointed out that, well, actually, we sell a range of things too. But by that stage, they'd closed down. And Jack Lum tells me it's 500 man-hours to get this from being completely empty to operational, fully stocked, is 500 man-hours. In other words, the 10 of their staff working for a week till they're ready to go again. That is the kind of confusion people faced.
But, and it's happening in Christchurch today. There are some retail stores that are requiring you to sign in, enforce distance between you and another customer, and there are others that aren't. So this is just hopeless and unacceptable, even taking into account that IMBI is a ministerial department of dubious use.
Why is it so difficult for them to use the law and issue legal instruments that people can look at and understand their rights? I would have thought this would be relatively straightforward. Would you have taken a different approach if you were still the Attorney General?
Well, the way I would have dealt with this issue is I'd been in Paris, Salzburg, and Munich toward the end of January, and so I knew that something was coming, even though there were only 8 cases of the virus the Saturday I flew home from Munich. And it was tolerably clear that something was going to happen, that we were in pandemic territory. I would have thought the sensible thing to have done in the first cabinet meeting of the year would have been to get a group of officials focusing very closely on the coming pandemic. Question 1, if we need to take extreme steps, have we got the law supporting us? And the answer was probably yes, because Helen Clark's government passed the Pandemic Preparedness Act, or whatever it's called, and that gave sufficient powers. And then there were other pieces of legislation as well, but I would have gone through that systematically so that one could move quickly, and if there were any gaps that needed to be dealt with, legislation could have been passed in the first few weeks of Parliament in February, March. The other thing I would point out is that when I was minister in charge of the security agencies, DPMC did a very important piece of work on what are the sort of national security risks the country could face. Toward the top of that list was pandemics. And that was done toward the end of 2016. So an interesting question would be, between the end of 2016 and the beginning of 2020, what work, if anything, did DPMC do to flesh out some of these security concerns, and particularly the issue of a pandemic?
It sounds as though they were woefully unprepared when it came to responding to a pandemic in a way that was legal. And a lot of what they've done has been an afterthought. So in response to questioning by the Epidemic Response Committee, Ashley Bloomfield, the Director General, issued a more comprehensive Section 70 notice on Saturday, the 2nd of April, which seemed to make things somewhat clearer for the last 3 weeks of the lockdown. But then I've always said that it's much better to pass a law that's debated in Parliament by democratically elected representatives of the people than have these sort of secondary instruments, Section 70 notices, states of emergency notices, or whatever. But on your theme of them being somewhat behind, or maybe it's my theme of them being somewhat behind the 8 ball, we then, this week, had legislation dropped on us at 5 p.m. on Monday, saying the government wishes to pass this law under urgency on Tuesday. And that was really quite an extraordinary thing. I might have the days wrong. It might have been Tuesday, then Wednesday. But in fact, no, it was Monday we got it at 5 o'clock. Tuesday we debated it all day. And then it went into the next day on Wednesday. So I just wonder, was it better to have a law that was debated in Parliament? I suspect you'll say yes. But do you have any comments on the public health law that was passed by Parliament this week? Is it sufficiently restrictive of the state, or does it give too much leeway to the orders that the Minister of Health can now make?
Yeah, well, I was pretty unimpressed with the way the legislation went through, and it seems to me that I'm in the interesting position of supporting the Chief Human Rights Commissioner, the Salvation Army, and an array of academics who said this stuff's not good. And we're in the very odd, indeed extraordinary situation where legislation's passed and it's going to have an immediate post-legislative review. I don't know, I've served on a number of subcommittees, I don't know about you, but one I served on in my first term in Parliament was the Justice Committee, and a little group got together to look at the evidence bill. And it was my idea that we have post-legislative reviews. I think it's Section 212 of the Evidence Act. Every 5 years, the law would be reviewed to see if the act was working. And so as a concept, post-legislative reviews, not a bad thing. But I've never heard of legislation being passed the next day that was, oh, we'll have some post-legislative review. I mean, it's a complete muddle.
You can't be very confident if you're asking for a review of your own law the next day.
Yeah, there are some real concerns about the legislation, and they could have been ironed out if people had adopted a make haste more slowly approach.
So in a perfect world, they would have been ready a lot earlier, and they would have done this in a more deliberative way. But we have what we have now. I think if there's one flashpoint of concern, or actually there's a couple with this new law. One is the ability of police to enter a home without warrant if they suspect that one of the public health orders is being breached. And Erica Stanford, who I really rate as an MP for the East Coast Bays seat up in the north of Auckland, she said, look, basically, if I'm suspected of having a birthday party for my children and the police suspect there's 11 people there, they can more easily enter my home than they can enter the Hells Angels pad for suspicion of drug dealing.
They would need a warrant under the Search and Surveillance Act.
Yes. Are people overreacting to this police power to warrantlessly enter homes, or is that a concern that you share?
Oh, no, well, I just want the law to be clear and predictable. And come back to the second point, questions of legal right and liability should be resolved by application of the law and not the exercise of discretion by the police. So make it clear. You are dealing with infringements on the liberty of the subject, so make it clear. And I can tell you now, if John Key's government or Bill English's government had passed something like that, the Greens, who have been remarkably quiet to date, would have been correctly, in my view, yelling and carrying on. And Dame Anne Salmond would have said it was the end of civilization as we know it. I remember her extravagant remarks in 2013 when the GCSB amending legislation was going through. She said, look, I'll never be able to celebrate Anzac Day anymore if this legislation is passed. She was really desperately upset, but Dame Anne, I think she's still around, nowhere to be seen. The Law Society has disappointed me in recent times because I think they've tried to be helpful to the government, but they haven't been raising questions such as Rodney Harrison would regularly raise about various National Party pieces of legislation. So it seems that a whole subsection of the community's fallen quiet because they want to be kind.
Yeah, it's the most extraordinary thing. And don't forget that your friend and a former colleague, the defender of the ordinary bloke and blokeess, the Right Honourable Winston Peters, has been quite happy to see all of this waved through and hasn't said boo to a ghost.
Yeah, well, it's, why ruin a pleasant Sunday afternoon by bringing up his name? Perhaps I'll just bite my tongue because this is a family program.
Sure. So the other aspect of this legislation that really jumped out at me, and a number of people have messaged me and sent through questions, is that it allows the government or the Minister of Health specifically to make rules that apply to a class of people. And I suspect what they had in mind was that perhaps they wanted to keep all the older people locked up because they're thought to be more vulnerable to COVID-19. This idea of being able to apply restrictions to a class of people seems very unusual, a little bit distasteful, and surely inconsistent with the principles you've spoken about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, there are the human rights aspects of it, and then the principle that I mentioned at the very start: the laws should apply equally to all, save to the extent that objective differences justify differentiation. But if you're going to have differentiation, spell out why.
Yep. Well, and the legislation certainly doesn't do that. It gives carte blanche to and hopes that the minister will do it, I suppose.
Well, again, that's potentially objectionable.
One thing that people have raised about this legislation is that it has been seen by some as an implicit concession that the level 3 and 4 rules were illegal, and they've added that with the Attorney General's refusal to furnish the Crown law advice that police were using as they went about trying to do their job under level 3 and 4. I don't suppose, what's your take on that? Is that a legitimate concern, or are people adding issues together that don't really need to be added?
Well, it is extraordinary that for the most severe levels, we haven't had the legislative underpinning that level 2 has. So that is, shall we say, odd. And it does seem as though they've been making it up on the hoof. The second point you raised is about the waiver of privilege point. Well, notwithstanding that David's been going around saying, the opinion gives me satisfaction that we can do what we want to do.
David Parker, that is.
Yeah, David Parker. That would have raised interesting questions about waiver of privilege. But can I simply say on the issue of waiver of privilege, several people have said, well, the Crown never waives privilege on legal opinions. Well, I was Attorney General for 9 years, and I regularly waived privilege. I would get a memorandum, for example, from Crown Law saying, we need your permission to waive privilege in whole or in part so that we can share this advice with XYZ, who may be working with the government on drawing up some new policy or drafting legislation. So it's simply not unheard of that in appropriate circumstances, privilege is waived, and there's no precedent for this stuff. You do it on the basis of principle in the particular case. And several times I went along with it. Several times I said, no, I'm not waiving privilege.
Well, that's very useful context, because David Parker, who I have to say I like on a personal level, has clung to his position like a sort of it sort of brings together a water rat type imagery to my mind. And I certainly think one of the most helpful things the government could do right now is just release the Crown law advice. Surely the public's right to know in these extraordinary circumstances trumps any precedent. It seems unusual that they claim, and it seems unusual that they claim extraordinary times when they need to act, but fall back on peacetime, if you like, excuses for not releasing information.
There's no precedent. You deal with each of these matters, requests for waiver of privilege, on the circumstances and given the nature of the advice.
Yeah. Can I ask a slightly different question? I think we've done a pretty good cross-examination of the government's response. But one of the things that really got me as a New Zealander was the way that a significant minority, certainly not all of my fellow New Zealanders, responded. I've always thought that we have the DNA of English liberalism throughout our constitutional settings and infrastructure, that we have never succumbed to the kind of dictatorship. Probably the Muldoon period was the closest that we got. And yet the way that the New Zealand people have responded has really worried me. It's interesting, in your speech you say that the only real check on government is public protest and opprobrium on the government of the day. But it seemed to me that during this crisis, a lot of New Zealanders were far more enthusiastic about calling police 10-5 or dobbing people in on the website the government set up for snitches than they were to support their fellow New Zealanders in questioning the government's direction. In fact, anyone who did question the government's direction, including journalists, and we'll get onto the media, got piled on opprobrium to a terrifying level. Now, maybe that's just me, but I wonder, based on what you said in your speech.
Former Professor Keith Sinclair, who once was the Labour candidate for what is now part of your seat, Eden, in, was it 1969, once famously described New Zealanders as the Prussians of the South Pacific. And frankly, one of my favourite films is a film about other people's lives, about how the Stasi operated in East Germany in the 1980s, and there was one brave man who stood up against them and got into all sorts of strife, and citizens were snitching on citizens and so on. And it makes one wonder whether, we really are the Prussians of the South Pacific, whether that is the kind of behaviour that we would want citizens of our country to engage in. I found it all a bit creepy at times. It's just not the New Zealand way of doing things, to go and pimp on people or contact the police. And I have to say, and this is a non-party political thing, I've actually found it very disappointing.
Yeah, the Lives of Others is a superb movie. We've got great weather in Auckland today, but if you're elsewhere in the country and looking for something to do on a lazy Sunday afternoon, I really recommend finding that on Netflix or wherever and checking it out if you haven't seen it. And if you have, it's worth seeing again. Great movie and a favourite of mine. Finally, just coming off what we've said about the public response, the media. Everyone loves to beat up on the media. I have a slightly more nuanced view, but I think that for the most part, we saw a media unwilling to take on the government. The best advice I've ever heard about a good journalist is somebody who finds information that the incumbent power structure does not want to become known and gets that information out and gets it to the public in a compelling way. What's your take on media performance through this crisis?
Oh, I've been generally disappointed. I thought that Tracy Watkins wrote a very good article last Sunday for the Sunday Star Times. I think Duncan Garner, Ryan Bridge, Sean Plunkett and others have done a very good job. The radio media have been very good. I don't think TVNZ's done a particularly good job. I think Hosking one morning had a number of statements made by the Minister of Finance, and they were simply repeated word for word by Simon Dallow on the 6 o'clock news. TV3's been pretty good. I'm a great fan of Tova O'Brien, because if you are woolly in any way, she'll rip your throat out, and she does that in a very non-partisan kind of way. So there are some very good people around, but I think that basically the press gallery, with some noble exceptions, has been very weak indeed. I mean, I don't know about Audrey, but she just simply writes these hagiographies about the Prime Minister every other day. And the Minister of Finance, she talked about the Minister of Finance's meticulous preparation for office between 2014 and 2017. Well, I've never seen a meticulous preparation by Grant, really. So you just have this sort of hagiography, this adulation going on. And I just think that I just like dissent. I love contrarian views. And I think it's very important in a time like this that you have the other side put. And whatever one says about the United States, one of my favorite websites is realclearpolitics.com. And they upload in a very objective way articles both for and against. So if you want to find something critical of Trump, then obviously you go to the Washington Post or the New York Times, but they also put up alternative views. There's not enough of that in this country. We need other views.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's in part a problem that faces New Zealand in a lot of areas. We only have 2 chains of supermarkets, and it's not a competition problem. The Warehouse, who are pretty good at retailing things, tried to enter the supermarket market and found it's not big enough. We've got a similar problem. I suspect even maintaining 5 newsrooms, there's going to be some consolidation. And one thing I suspect you'll agree, but you don't have to, is that finding a bespoke New Zealand solution for having a free media that allows us to have a big country political debate while being a small country is something that, one of the big issues we're going to have to work through in the years to come.
Totally agree. And whatever one thought about it, the listener provided an alternative view. Gone. And sometimes you'd get quite good journalism in North and South and others. Gone. So we do suffer in that regard, and I must confess I don't know what the solution is.
Yeah, well, we got a few ideas, and it might actually be an idea for another Sunday session. Look, we've had a number of questions emailed through from our usual crowd, but as it happens, just about all of them we've been able to weave into the discussion about legality of the lockdown, butchers and veggie stores. Trish asked about the way that laws are being made up. And so for a lot of these questions, I think we've addressed them. I should just mention somebody who's made a complaint that Bed Bath & Beyond forced them to give their details and then started mass marketing. I really like Bed Bath & Beyond. I hope that's not true. But if you are a retailer and you're using people's data got from them on security bases, which turns out retailers don't even have to collect people's data, please don't spam people, because it might feel good to send them emails, but in the end, they will judge you. So that's really a wrap for us. Chris, it's been so great to have you on. Are there any closing comments or issues, concerns, suggestions or comments that you have?
No, the only point I'd make is that the stuff's not for lawyers, and there's a tendency for a lot of these kinds of comments to be made at grand legal dinners while people are passing around the port. But this stuff is important for all of us, and it was important that I be put through the hoops when I was dealing with the reform of the intelligence legislation. The questions were raised about some of the things Muldoon got up to in the early 1980s, and it's equally important now that we have this kind of discussion, and that it's simply, it is not the preserve of the left, it's not the preserve of the right. We are all subject to the law, and everyone, regardless of whether it's a sort of a liberal conservative administration or a social democratic one, should be held to account to make sure that we are all acting in accordance with these fundamental principles.
And just to wind you up with one last question, Mike Dixon on the chat says, Chris, any thoughts of coming back to politics?
No, because when I'm a great believer in term limits, and I think that people who stay in there too long are of limited use. The way I would deal with it is I would say that after 5 terms, you have to take a compulsory 3-year sabbatical at least. So I don't want to go back. I'm enjoying what I'm doing. Hopefully toward the end of the year, my book on treaty negotiations will be published. And then what I want to do is work with a couple of former attorneys general from around the Commonwealth, funnily enough, on a book on the Attorney General and the rule of law. So, but I'm very happy, you just don't walk out of that place and turn your back on it. You remain deeply, deeply interested, and you want to make sure that those who come after you, like you, are supported where necessary, and have your chance to make your contribution.
Well, thank you, Chris. And it would be easy for you to have said no to this interview. I'm living my life now, and why should I bother? But you're a true public servant, and you continue to keep your oar in. And I think that the politics in New Zealand's a lot better for it. So thank you, and we'll look forward to your books coming out. Isn't it great we could have this crisis so you've got some extra content, and we hope to see you around soon.
Good man. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stay